Mark Dooley, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Very glad to be here, John.
Well, likewise, thanks for joining me in this ethereal digital realm here. I'm glad you joined me. I first learned of you as I was reading a collection of essays that you had edited posthumously for Roger Scruton, one of, I would say, not just England and Britain's finest philosophers, but arguably one of the finest philosophers in the Western tradition of his era. There's no doubt about it, in my view. And the book was called Against the Tide, and a very rousing book, and showed Scruton's legacy to the philosophical tradition, and how to I suppose push back against groupthink and a mob mentality. And we'll get into that in the fullness of time. And of course, Scruton was probably one of the people who found himself at the centre of what we would now call the culture wars, and had been a casualty of those himself, though he managed to find his way through. But before we speak about Roger Scruton, and indeed your relationship with him and Jacques Derrida, someone who is also a philosophical heavyweight in his own right, you have written extensively in your own work about culture wars. And in fact, you quote, say, "Let us avoid talk of a culture war when what we are engaged in is nothing less than a lethal spiritual conflict." Why are we in a spiritual conflict rather than a culture war?
Because those who oppose the traditional values and those who oppose custom and convention, which have always been the guiding lights for real culture, by which I mean they've always helped us to advance to the future with the spotlight to the past, or shining a spotlight to the past as our guide. Those who oppose this don't offer a rival culture. They offer destruction, devastation. Their intent has always been, as revolutionaries from time immemorial have wanted, to tear down the culture and to replace it with some abomination. In this case, I mean, even those who first initiated or inaugurated this style of devastation, let's say the French revolutionaries, they were very cultured people. Their aim was not to have a revolution that ended in terror, although most do. Their aim was to, establish another form of life, and for good or for ill, but it certainly wasn't to destroy everything that had gone before, although they made a good fist of doing that with many of the institutions, most notably the church. But in this day and age, what we've got are people who repudiate entirely their heritage, repudiate entirely the fact that they might actually be made by something other than themselves, and want to recast identity from the most basic biological level as something that is up for grabs. Now that seems to me that is not a culture. That's not built on any sacred text. It's not built on a legacy or a heritage. That's built on some sort of demonic cry for destroying the fabric of a civilization which is founded within or on religious values, and recasting it as something barren and empty, something that's given over to death rather than over to life.
You talked about a repudiation of heritage. I suppose one thing which Roger Scruton made very popular within public philosophy was the politics of home. And the argument he advanced repeatedly was that we've are ruled by a political class and more informally by a cultural elite who, as you said, repudiate heritage. They're actually driven not by a sense of home, but usually for more abstract ideals of justice that are global in scale and are usually backed by some kind of social engineering programs that are in line with their ideological proclivities, and and often they worked counter to the interests of where it was they were supposed to be governing, or where it was that they were from. And he called these people oikophobic, an ancient Greek term, which to say, the fear of home, or kind of hatred of home. What you're an Irishman, and you're in Ireland right now. How would you say the state of politics is in Ireland? Are your politicians oikophobic? And if so, why? If that's not too much of a leading question.
Yeah, it's very complex in Ireland. I mean, it's much easier to talk about it in terms of Great Britain and so on. But to give it my best shot, and complex because of our difficult, history. Yes, I've, in my columns in the European Conservative, I have labeled my own country the woke capital of Europe, because our politicians, such as they are, have embraced every woke cause that's going. And not only that, but they've tried to be ahead of the bandwagon with each one of them, So anything that you see on the horizon with, a banner that reads woke, you can be sure that the Irish are holding the banner. And it is destroyed the cultural and social fabric of the country in the short term, since around 2014, 2015. And yet, the ordinary people still have a sense of belonging, a sense of home, as all ordinary people do, deep in their hearts. We don't think globally. We are not global entities. We are local entities. We attach ourselves to places, to common places that we can nurture and cherish, and which provide the basis of our memories and our cohabitation. And that's in broadly speaking, that is what a home is. But we are driven by that. We have an instinctual need for that. Nobody identifies themselves as a global citizen. I mean, you can say that in when you're in front of a group of woke students, and get cheered on. But when you go home, you still go home to your family, and you still talk about your neighbours and your community and so on. And those are the things that will draw on your resources for immediate attention and affection. So in this country, we've seen recently a backlash against an attempt, for one minor example, but it is significant nonetheless. There was an attempt by the government to remove mothers or motherhood from the Constitution, a referendum. And it was resoundingly defeated by the people. It led to the resignation of then Prime Minister Leo Varadkar. And it was proof positive, as if we needed any, that in the undergrowth, the people who don't have a voice on the woke loudspeaker, they are saying enough is enough. This is our home. We have lived this way. We have for our history. We have children to bring up in this world, and we don't want them being brought up like that. So, or with that value system, if you can call it that. So, like all countries in the West now, there is a tension between, as you call them, the elites, who desire this kind of utopia where we all abandon our sense of home for love of the world, or love of the cosmos, or love of whatever it is, or love of creation, and those of us who still cherish homely things, and especially at this time of year when people return to their homes, their physical homes, from the social sphere, and they try to recreate at Christmas time and at Thanksgiving in the States that sense of belonging that is so inherent in the human condition. So that's the battle, and those are the battle lines, and it is a spiritual battle because home is a spiritual entity. It's what Benedict XVI used to call the homeland of the heart. And it's when no matter where you are, you still have that sense of home. Even if you're not particularly attached to a place, you want to belong to a people, to a time, and to a place.
It's very interesting you talk about belonging and linking it back to the point you made about we're not global citizens, we all belong somewhere, is as a brief biographical interlude here, I left school early at 17. I definitely had a sense of who I was and the part of the country I was from, Northumberland in England. Went off to Manchester because I wasn't particularly happy about my prospects with no qualifications. And anyway, as I was working my way up the ladder and started to find myself in more white-collar jobs, I found myself rubbing shoulders with people who were graduates. So I was never part of the university system. And I certainly noticed there was a difference between how I saw the world and how they saw the world. But because I felt like my status was quite low and that these seemed like quite up-and-coming people, I started to align myself with these views. I started to read The Guardian quite a lot. It was about my only source of information, as well as the odd Noam Chomsky book and various other heavily left-leaning literature and media. And over time, I found myself using words like global citizen because I started to do little bits of travel, and I'd tell people, I feel at home anywhere. Anyway, later on, I did some online degrees. Again, not being part of that university thing meant I maintained a level of independence, but I did go in with a certain mindset, and it started to fall apart for various reasons. And when it really started to fall apart was I've been learning German in a night class whilst I was living in Leeds, and decided before I moved to London I'd have a sabbatical in Germany, but I thought I might stay forever because I know the language really well. And I was also of the view, as many people were at that time, of that age, that Germany was this beacon, and we were just the backwards British. And so I went to Germany, lived with some Germans, had a great time, learned the language really, really well. But one thing that became clear was not only was I not a global citizen, but I certainly wasn't German. And then I realized that I was British and that I'd been pretty ungrateful about the inheritance that I'd received from the country, that I'd effectively repudiated it. I was the oikophobe through and through. I would always be talking it down. But things just started to fall apart, and my worldview started to shift from that moment, and found myself certainly longing for a belonging. And I find it remarkable that we do find within media a kind of celebration of the disintegration of home in some way. And I saw a clip from Irish TV recently, actually, and this is linking, I think, to the heavy immigration that you have going on at the moment. Obviously, we do in Britain. And there was I don't know who the presenter was, but there was an Irish presenter, and he was with someone of West African heritage who had an Irish inflected accent. And the interview was about the West African saying, Ireland's changed, it's different now. There's people from here, there, everywhere. And then he kind of celebrated that the white people are going extinct. And there was no challenge to that. And I think what we're starting to see in the culture is that even people who wanted to hold on to those the respectable views that allowed the taboos to remain with regards to not wanting to make people feel excluded from what it means to be Irish or British, is now I think people are starting to see that peoples equals culture at scale, and you can't necessarily have an Ireland if you're going to celebrate the diminishing of the Irish people, the indigenous Irish people. What would you say is the current understanding of all of this within the Irish electorate? Do you find that you have people reaching out for solutions to this? Is this a conversation that is being had, or is it not?
It's a conversation that is being had by force of circumstance, because up to quite recently, it was a conversation that was taboo. But now, thanks to a pretty awful riot that took place last a year around this time, were terrible devastation by thugs, actually. But it was spurred on by an attack on school children by an immigrant. A very complex situation. It wasn't a normal, just gratuitous attack. But nonetheless, it kick-started this riot. And all of a sudden, as usual, in Western countries, something happens, and then there's this rearguard action, which produces, well, now in order to retain power, we've got to address this problem. And suddenly, because they have abandoned those who feel alienated in their own land for so long, to switch around and to say, well, now we're on your side and we're going to do something about this situation, seems kind of, well, pathetic to most people, really. But nonetheless, they were glad to hear it. Now, funny enough, the strong talk about immigration was good, and it produced, a positive result in the polls in advance of a general election, which we just had. However, the item itself drifted down to something like 7% of those polled in advance of the election said this was the primary concern. It was, during the summer, the hot issue. But when other issues such as the economy drift in, and cost of living, and Donald Trump, and all of these other things, with our shortest attention span, this drifted down in people's interests and concerns. However, it is a subject that will not go away. And for as long as... what it did do, however, was it opened up the space whereby the conversation could be had. It was no longer a taboo conversation. And it is a very important conversation. It's an important conversation because it really does determine who we want to be, what we are, and where we go from here. So, yes, that's where it stands now. All European countries are experiencing similar turbulence. And thanks to, populations standing up and saying enough is enough, we are going to have a say. Not in a racist way, but in a way that, we have to, Derrida himself used to say this, champion of those who might oppose, those who espouse oikophilia, not oikophobia. Oikophilia is love of home. He used to say, how can you be a host if you do not have a home? If we do not preserve the home, if we do not preserve what we are and who we are, how can we welcome people into that? Because giving away our home, as certain of his French contemporaries, and abandoning it to the open border policy, these universalist claims, means you don't have a home to give. It becomes a free-for-all. It becomes a non-entity, not something with which you cannot identify, and it becomes destitute and derelict. So to avoid that, we must speak.
The notion of needing to have a home before you could welcome people into it. I've seen quite a lot of videos online of the response of communities in rural Ireland where there have been plantations. And I think that sounds like a very strong word, but you can see aerial footage of big construction sites where large numbers of migrants who are being bussed in and flown in the various international agreements are being housed and put up against the will of the locals who don't want this. They're primarily young men who are joining or coming to the country from all over the world. These facilities are being guarded by the local police force, and you can see that people feel betrayed, that they never had an option, that they've just got to go along with it and accept it. And we're starting to see that in Britain too. There are videos coming out of council meetings where people are questioning the housing of large numbers of the asylum seekers that have come over on the small boats in hotels, sometimes near schools, being whole hotels being rented out and then being guarded by immigrants themselves. And what's quite interesting is linking all of this. I'd like to get your view on British and Irish relations in the wake of not welcoming in, but receiving a great many different peoples from everywhere, but say this archipelago that we call home. Because I saw a meme online. I mean, memes seem to spread the culture a lot these days, if that's what you can call it. But there's a meme which had a picture of an Anglo, a picture of a Celtic person, and one of them said something like stupid Fenian, and the other one said something derogatory back about the English and the British, and then the next line was them with a bunch of people who've just arrived who are saying different things in insult to them, and then the final set being those two looking at each other saying, maybe we have more in common than we thought. And indeed there was a big protest up in Belfast it was a pro-Palestine protest, and there were various flags being flown on that side, trans flags, Palestine flags, socialist worker flags. And on the other side, there was the Union flag alongside an Irish tricolour flag, and they were on the same team, and they were waving them together, saying, these are the peoples of this island. Do you think there is something shifting beneath the ground there in Ireland about relations between the different peoples that have historically been part of it?
Well, you see, I think that it all depends on who you're speaking to, of course. The people, you see, that you mentioned at the beginning, you've got to separate out media voices from everyday voices, ordinary voices that are not heard. You mentioned Noam Chomsky, who came up with a very nifty phrase called manufactured consent. I think that the media is always into manufacturing consent, consenting to their own ideals of the world. But the people who don't get a hearing ordinarily on official channels identify with anyone who respects home. So if there's an Irish rural person who is attached to the land, is attached to ancestry, is attached to heritage, is attached to custom, is attached to belonging, is attached to family, is attached to the homeland, they will identify with the same person no matter where they are. Now, you don't necessarily have to be rural. You can be a city dweller and see the destruction of home everywhere, because our cities are undergoing social experiments left, right, and center in all of the institutions. But you can still identify with people who hold similar values. So, those who turn their noses up at the likes of reform voters, let's say. I'm interested in reform voters. You might not be interested in reform, but I'm interested in reform voters. I want to see what type of people these are, what makes them tick, what are their local interests and concerns. And you will invariably find that they are the very same as the people who don't have a party in Ireland to represent them. There's no party of a similar ilk in Ireland currently. Minor one maybe, composed primarily of independents, but nothing of substance yet. But that will grow in time, I suspect. But nonetheless, I'm interested in that because, these are the people who hitherto have been silenced for 4 decades, and are now being heard because the political establishment has to listen because their vote is being threatened. But I'm interested not in hearing what Nigel Farage has to say, but I'm interested in hearing what his supporters have to say, because there you find the true concern. There you find the true instinct when it comes to preserving home and what that means for the British people.
Interesting. I was speaking to a politician the other day in London, not on the record, and we were talking a little bit about some of the discourse you see online when people are disappointed perhaps when, say, Farage is now giving interviews where his tone might have softened in a few areas, but that's not what people want. But then it's on certain media channels which not every single person is watching. And the politician said to me, it doesn't really matter. We might be unhappy with that, or there might be a softening here or there, but it's a niche concern for those who are very online. But actually, go and speak to the people in the Wetherspoons or out at work, and they effectively just care about what this is, which is a vehicle to put a shot across the bows of the thing that's not working and which they've been trying to say is not working for a long time. So to them, it represents something which is the opposite to this thing which they don't like and have had forced on them for so long. And I think, Mark, bringing in Roger Scruton a little bit, he was a conservative who made the point that conservatism is not an ideology; it's a disposition. It's something which those with the disposition would, in the face of social engineering or some big policy idea, would say, or perhaps shout out, "Stop! Wait!" It's a bit like Chesterton's fence: don't remove it until you know what it's for. Suspicious of social engineers, utopians. I think it's also fair to say that conservatism has been on a hiding to nothing in the wake of liberal progressivism, Islamism, mass immigration, the rise of sectarian politics more broadly. And so I know we can never really ascribe some thoughts to someone who's no longer with us, but what do you think Scruton would make of calls that you can find, particularly on the American conservative side, that are saying it's counter-revolution that we need, insofar as it's rooting various practices and ideals out of institutions, it's stopping funding towards institutions who are undermining all of the values and the traditions, the customs you've been talking about, and it's about going after where the money is. Do you think Roger Scruton would recognise that there might be a need for a counter-revolutionary movement to root this out, or would he suggest something else?
Well, he probably wouldn't use that term, but he would subscribe to, a wholesale eradication of the worst excesses of this movement. The destruction of education, for example. Education was always a primary interest of his, because he who controls the classroom controls the future of the country. And therefore, to see the degradation which is spread like wildfire through the curricula of the Western nations was devastating for him. Because, you firstly, when you start messing around with and dumbing down and eviscerating and then injecting a child's curriculum with kind of this demonic, as I've referred to it before, ideology, whereby the whole construct of what it means to be human is reformulated as a benign sort of curiosity for you, to learn in the classroom. That is not something that we can take lightly and say, well, now that's an accepted part of where we are, and we can leave that. And no, you can't leave that intact. You've got to counter that with everything that you've got and show why that is intrinsically wrong, not only from a scientific perspective, but from a moral and a sociological and a religious perspective. Because once you start tinkering with things like that, and once you start tinkering with things like history, and once you start tinkering like, the famous, we thought it was bad when the famous French feminist philosopher Lucy Irigaray came out and said that Einstein's famous equation was a sexed equation. That was one often you could easily dismiss that as the kind of ravings of the cultural elite in Paris, of a certain time. But that has become the norm. So no, you don't look at that benignly. You say, no, this has to be countered because this is detaching children from their primary source, their sacred source. It's detaching them from history. It's detaching them from real culture. It's detaching them from memory. It is making them home haters, oikophobes. And so what type of future are we setting ourselves up to endure with this? So there's one example of an institution, solely education, both in the university and in the schools, which needs root and branch reform, now robust reform. I know Donald Trump has set his sights on this, but I think that's the type of thing. I don't think Roger Scruton, calm and all as he was, would say, now check your horses a little. This needs to be done gently and lightly. No, it doesn't, because for every child that is put through that, you're setting up another disaster 20 years from now.
Mark, you have made many positive cases for the cultural inheritance of Christian civilization, and maybe let's delve into that a little bit more in the context of those who would dismiss it. Let's think about the moral and cultural revolution, as Peter Hitchens would call it, that's taken place since the Second World War, where we now live in an unrecognizable time compared to our forebears. And actually, someone I just interviewed for the second time in the podcast, Ed West, the historian and journalist, he said there's every chance that the generations that have followed from the Second World War onwards, there's more difference between that point and before than there would have been from the pre-Second World War and the medieval times, because of the level of continuity with how we saw the world, and the various customs, rituals, traditions, morals that we held. Obviously, if you're someone who is trying to dismiss that, you're going to probably characterize the world as oppressive, and that this move toward liberty and self-actualization has been much, much better for the human condition than what came before, which was stuffy and oppressive. What would you say to those people? Because you've made the point that you used Matthew Arnold's words, which was that the best that has been thought and said was what came out of Christian civilization. What did you mean by that?
It was, and it was everyone, every major intellectual up to a certain point in the 20th century, every major intellectual that preceded them thought that, or felt, believed what Matthew Arnold said. They believed that you could not have a successful society unless you imbued children, and thus the citizens of those societies, with the cultural inheritance which flowed downstream from Christian thought. We are, the West is Christian. It's as simple as that. You may not like that, but then you're going to spend your life repudiating that notion and saying that that's wrong and that we have to fight against this, and thus you're reaffirming it all the while. I mean, I often love, Nietzsche's or Hegel's observation that you affirm that which you deny. They constantly keep alive the things that they want to destroy by, predicating their identity on opposition to it. So we flow downstream from that great heritage. And even those atheists, a point that Roger used to make consistently, those atheist intellectuals of the 19th century, who didn't go for the theological basis of Christianity, still felt, despite, like John Stuart Mill, for example, still felt, despite the challenges that he was making to the status quo, still felt that you couldn't have a society without the religious and Christian constructs that were in place. Because I even see that Dawkins now is coming around to that view, however belatedly. Because the point is, in order to have a successful society, you have to have people who recognize that we have points in human life that are sacred, that not all can be profane as they would have it today. There are sacred moments such as births and deaths, marriages, lost loves, children growing up and all the rites of passages that they must undergo. And all of this is celebrated within communities and given a kind of a halo of perfection through the religious norms and institutions that are there. They link us to the past, but not only, they link us to the dead. They link us to the great heroes of the faith who stand before us as role models. We call them saints. They are role models of perfection, moral perfection for us downstream for them, or in those of us who stand in their shadow. So we are linked to the, as Edmund Burke most beautifully put it, society is not a contract between the living only, but a contract between the living, the dead, and the unborn. So those constructs, those religious and Christian constructs, link us to all of that, which is why when you walk into a church, for example, you're not just walking into a building, you're walking into memory, the living embodiment of memory of the dead, memory of those who stood on those altars before you, who laid down their lives for them. You're bound together to a sacred place, by a sacred place, and in a sacred place. And from that sacred place went forth the generations which preceded you, and to a lesser extent, those who will succeed you today. So the importance of this cannot be underestimated. And anybody who thinks that we can forge forward without looking to this to safeguard society, to usher society forward on its next great movement, is deluded, in my opinion.
That sense of being in a place where others have been before, and you were making allusions to worship, and I suppose in that respect, that even as someone who's coming up to my own wedding day next year, it was never in doubt that we would choose the more traditional approach and speak the same words that everyone has done before, and the same vows in the eyes of gods, because that's how it is that you come to do the union of souls and make those commitments. But it's very powerful when you do find yourself in those moments where you realize that it isn't just about you, and many others have gone before you who are no longer here. And you even get that when you that sense when you go into those really ancient places. And one of the first times I had this wave come over me of realizing what you just laid out there, that contract between the living, the dead, and those yet to be born, is I'd gone on it was partly driven by wanting to understand a bit about why England has churches on every street corner and why we had the morals and the mores we do. And so I went on this ecclesiastical tour. I'd made for myself some of the ruined monasteries. At the time, I wasn't a Christian. I had been a militant atheist of the Dawkinsian type, for sure. And I found myself going around North Yorkshire, and I spent some time in Ampleforth Abbey. That was a pretty revelatory experience, ushered into a mass, and I'll save the rest for another time. But I went to visit this church that had been around since, I think, something like the 400-500s. It was built. Now clearly it was a structure that was built later on, but the foundations were still there, and they built by, or at least they were made famous by Saint Chad. And there was it's in Lastingham in North Yorkshire, and in the cellar, it's still got the same layout as when he was there, and indeed his tomb is in there. And walking in, and again, this is before I'd even really read around all of this stuff, there was just this sense that this was something bigger and deeper than I'd ever get my head around. And I suppose my question to you, Mark, is, you talked about how the West is Christian, whether we like it or not, and we can spend our lives repudiating it. To take Ed West's point further, the break between what came before the Second World War and afterwards is so huge that if someone was cryogenically frozen, as I think he's put it before, and was woken up 70 years later, he would think he was in another country or in another universe, because we have started to invert a lot of the ideals that we had through generations because of Christianity. And you've talked about the culture of death, for example, and I'd suspect if people saw the cultural discourse around abortion and euthanasia or assisted suicide, they would be really shocked. And so my question to you is, in this age of the machine, as many have called it, Scruton, you, Paul Kingsnorth, where we're living in a perpetual present, we're constantly distracted, we're moving around between apps, we're choosing to amuse ourselves to death, which is probably not too hyperbolic, but perhaps it is. Do you think it's possible for people to, one, recognize that inheritance, that bond, these deeper things, even to have a sense, those revelatory moments, those transcendental moments, and then beyond that, to even recognize that where we've come from, that it's actually worth preserving? Or do you think we're coming up to a bit of a sliding doors moment where the further we go along this path you've been talking about, this path of repudiation, that we'll lose the ability to do that and to recognize its virtues?
It's very interesting indeed, because Ed West is definitely right. And this is a result of primarily movements in philosophy, I'm ashamed to say, that enshrined all of this kind of professional nonsense through the works of early continental philosophers that were taken up by mainstream media and universities and pushed then as an agenda. But so he's right there, that there is a lingering remnant, as you discovered in your own life, of this in every village, in the West, across the West. No matter how far the repudiation has gone, no matter how intense it is, there is a lingering spirit of it in every village, in every town, in every city. You drive through Paris, for example, and you see the beautiful cathedrals, almost empty, but they stand there as a reminder of who you, as French people, are and were and can be. And then the likes of Notre Dame opens up again, and people find, for one brief instant, they find that spirit welling up in them. It's no longer something distant that stands on the horizon, the cathedral that you pass in the car. Now it's part of who you are again. Now it'll die down in a week or two, as it always does, and then move on to something else in this age of distraction. But nonetheless, it ignites a flame. And when people come to me with stories of despair and how are we going through, when I speak in public, for instance, the first question I'm always asked is, how are we going to reverse the devastation? How can we ever roll back the tyranny of destruction? And what can we do in hand-wringing and all of this? My answer is simple. St. Paul of Tarsus, stood before the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire. Of all things, with a small motley crew of apostles who carried his cloaks and his sticks and his papyrus around the empire. And he had a word, what he called, he says, we are a remnant who are being slaughtered and battered and bruised and tortured and shipwrecked all day long for the glory of Christ. But we count it all rubbish for just to know him, to know Christ, right? It seemed hopeless. It seemed hopeless. And yet the house churches were there. The spirit, just like we have now, the spirit was still there. In every little town he went into, there were Christians. Now, it took 300 years, I'll grant you. But eventually, the walls of Rome fell, and Christianity stepped into the breach. One example. Example two is Roger Scruton's own life. When he went to the Iron Curtain countries in the 1980s to give hope to the hopeless, he went as to preach underground seminars, and I use preach purposely because that's what he was doing. He was preaching hope to the enslaved, to the Marxist dystopia, to people like Václav Havel and ordinary people like priests and poets and chimney sweeps, all of whom assembled in these underground seminars. And he went there to teach Aristotle and aesthetics, because that was going to guide them back to the future, as it were. That's what they would embrace when they came from the catacombs and reclaimed their homes, their ancient homelands, which had been destroyed and devastated in the name of some utopian scheme, universalist scheme by the communists. Much more devastating than what some would say than we have now, although not as lethal spiritually, in my opinion, because the old structures were still hankered after. The people didn't embrace their enslavement with the euphoric cries such as our own do. But nonetheless, the monolith was there, and I remember at the same time saying, this can never possibly end. This is with us for eternity. He did too. The secret police, as you probably know the story, in the Czech lands of ancient Prague, eventually got a hold of him after he left one of the seminars one evening, threw him down a staircase, beat him up, imprisoned him, exiled him the next day, and marched him across the border at gunpoint and put him on, yes, and I kid you not, the index of undesirable persons, as it was called. He returned 4 years later to a free Czech Republic, ruled by the very same people that were in the underground. So that's what we've got to look forward to. All it takes is for one event, such as as I was referring earlier on, such as the event in Dublin last year, such as, the election of Trump in America and the rise of ordinary Americans again to reclaim their heritage. All it takes is just, who would have thought at the zenith of Biden's victory back in 2020 that we'd be where we are today? So, no, you don't be hopeless. You don't despair. You don't say, oh, it's gone forever. How can we ever get the youth to embrace the fact that they come from somewhere rather than nowhere? And to be citizens, as Scruton used to put it, of somewhere rather than nowhere. Our nothingness. You don't ever fall into that despair. You keep living your life as if the whole world shared your values. And because it's so unique these days and so novel, people will look at you and they'll say, hey, I want to be like that. I want to do that type of thing. I want to live that way. And you'll be surprised at how quickly the whole thing could turn around.
Well, that was a very rousing response. And I know the importance of role models. And I think if there's any hope to be had, we don't necessarily want to invest it all in one person, but if there are enough people that are trying to live as uprightly as possible, live the right way, turn their back on what you've called the culture of destruction and death, I think we could turn the tide. And actually, I think what's probably important to bring across here, this isn't just an idea of conservative versus liberal, like this notion of going out to the catacombs, as it were, to withdraw from a bit of a crazy world, but ultimately keep the flame alive before re-entering again. I have a sneaking suspicion it goes much more broadly than those with conservative inclinations. You see these alliances, even if they're informal, between, particularly here in Britain, between old Labour types and conservatives, who look around and go, what is this? It's unrecognizable. And they find themselves on panel discussions largely agreeing. Now, they know that one day the election day will come up and they might not always agree, but I think people are typically seeing that the world which we've come to live under is not particularly good for human flourishing.
Right, John. And I would say, sorry to cut across you, I would say, for example, George Orwell is precisely the type of person you're talking about. He was an old leftist who was a patriot. And you look at his essays in Politics and the English Language, for example, like Politics in the English Language as one example, or you look at his sarcastic, comments about these people who, sit in the luxury of the West and support Stalin, for example, sit in the coffee houses of Western cities and cheer on the Reds. That was totally unpatriotic. So the old left had no truck with that. In fact, Roger Scruton, at the end of his life, forged his father and himself had a very difficult. In my book, Conversations with Roger Scruton, he goes into this in great detail. I have the famous line from that opening conversation that we had. It was not a happy home, he said, of his time, with Jack Scruton, his dad, and who was an old socialist school teacher, rather maniacal character. But he forged an alliance with them at the end of his days because they both recognized, one being now, a conservative, very famous conservative at this point, and still this frustrated old school teacher with socialist inclinations, that their common home in terms of architecture was being despoiled. And of course, Roger wrote extensively on architecture, and he saw that as central to the maintenance of home. But so too did Jack Scruton, despite their differences. And so the attempt to save High Wycombe, as one example that where the childhood home was, from the destruction of postmodern architects, was something that brought them very close at the end of their days, and they spoke on common platforms and so on. Remarkable thing to happen. So the old left certainly has common alliance with traditional conservatives when it comes to repudiating the woke agenda, when it comes to repudiating postmodernism, when it comes to repudiating oikophobia. Now, I will say this too. You look, for example, there's one phenomenon which points to how salvation can be had, and that is, and it's only one. I'm not saying people ought to do this, but it's an interesting sociological observation. When the then Pope Benedict XVI took the restrictions off the Latin Mass, for example, in 2007. The congregations of those masses in Catholicism boomed and have boomed ever since. And they have boomed with young people, young, university-educated people. There was a time when you'd find only the legal types and the professional types going against the grain of Vatican II and attending. No. Now you go into these churches, and if such as they're allowed to be had in churches under the pontificate of Francis, but you go into these places where the Mass is celebrated, and you see churches the way they used to be, bulging at the seams, but primarily with these young, sophisticated people who not only recognize the spiritual value of this and the mystical value of it, but they also recognize the aesthetic value of it. Because in it, of course, central to it is beauty as a doorway to the sacred and the opening up of the divine in and through beauty. And they contrast that with the world outside the church doors. All they have to do, I remember taking my own son, my eldest son, he served the Latin Mass for a time when those restrictions were lifted. And I never had to teach him about the degradation of our culture. He formed that judgment by himself, just through experience. It's like what Aristotle used to say in the Nicomachean Ethics. You don't teach children morality. They won't know what you're talking about. If you start going on about the moral law, they look at you as if you're an alien. So what you do, says Aristotle, is you show them the courageous person. You show them the wise person. You show them the honorable person, and you say, imitate that. And so they see the appearance of the person, and they contrast it with the awfulness elsewhere, and they say, no, that's the truth. That is the authentic thing. I see it now, and that is what I'm going to pursue. And so when you walk out and you see the degradation of the cities, and you see the degradation of the culture, you say, no, I have seen the truth. Which is why Jesus can stand before us and say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I'm a person. Imitate me. Do as I do. So when the young person walks out of these sacred settings and they see the aesthetics of our world, such as they are, they say, no, that's rubbish. I want the reality. I want the authentic. And that's where I'm going from now on. That's who I am. So you see, when an avenue of reality and authenticity is opened up to the youth, they unplug. They want to unplug because there's something deep within us that wants to connect with reality, with truth. It may be tried to say that we're hardwired for truth, but we are. Mm-hmm. So those who say that we're in a post-truth era, again, are get comfortable with delusion. But truth there is, and it's there to be had, and it's there to be seen. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Reality always wins, as they say. But it's been an absolute pleasure. But before I let you go, there's a question I like to ask all of my guests, which is, what have you changed your mind on in the course of your life that was big, weighty, something which you thought would stand the test of time? It's an absolute, but then things changed. And what was it that made you change your mind?
Something very similar to your own experience. I was very devoted to all of the things as a youngster, to all of the things that we've spoken about today. And then I took my detour into liberalism as a young academic. And we never got to speak about Derrida, but he was instrumental in that. And yet there is a strong conservative element to his thought. But he became a good friend, and I realized that this was no zealot. He was somebody who really was a kind of committed intellectual, first-rate intellectual, but who saw the need for culture and the need for inheritance, but wanted to loosen it up a little bit to let hidden voices, come forth and into the light. But he helped me on that pilgrimage away from my ancestry, never losing sight of the essentials. But one day, I stumbled into this old church, which I knew very well. And yet, when I walked in, I was hit with those ancestral voices. That they surrounded me as if... Now, I literally mean they surrounded me. I don't mean figuratively. They literally surrounded me. And they called me home. And I've been there ever since.
Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure. I hope we get to talk again and we can talk about Derrida and much else by the sounds of things. But we certainly didn't get through everything we thought we would today. So I think there's life and more conversation yet. And before I let you go, what can people expect from you next? Are you working on anything? And where can they find you in the dark corners of the internet, if anywhere?
Yes, drmarkdooley.com. Very simple, drmarkdooley, all one word.com. And well, I'm continuing. There's something coming out all the time. But I'll just let you go to the website, and I'm not going to blow my own trumpet. You can put yourself to sleep with some good articles there and other things besides.
Brilliant. Well, Mark, it's been a pleasure. Have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and hope to speak to you in 2025.
Yes, of course, John. Thank you very much. God bless you.
All the best. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.